you can't see that beautiful blue screen behind me. When I tried to load it, it made it look as if my head was on fire. And I thought that that might be a serious distraction over the next half hour or so. So I'm afraid you have my conservatory. Apologies for that.
Sounds a bit in line with Halloween coming up.
It does, doesn't it? So secondly, it's nice to see a few people from Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Middle East taking part in this conference. And to those of you listening now, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Nice to see you all, and I miss you. So I'm going to just get this screen sorted out somewhere. Here we go. Let's see if I can turn it into a PowerPoint slideshow. Wait a minute. Yes, there we are. Can everybody see that? Good. Okay, so let's kick off then. And can I say, if you want to send any texts or stop me or turn me off, that's fine. But I'll just plow on. And then later on, there'll be a good length of time for us to discuss various ideas arising out of the stuff we're going to talk about now. So, 1 second. Yeah. Okay. So, can you see this little quotation? Claire's talking about quotations. Here's one from a chap called Cicero, and he's actually one of my favorite personalities from the ancient world. And in case it's difficult for you to read your screen, I'll read it out for you. It's not by strength or speed or swiftness of body that great deeds are done, but by wisdom, character, and sober judgment. And these qualities are not lacking in old age, but in fact grow as time passes. So much as I agree with his sentiments, I'm afraid he didn't live up to them. His fatal error was to talk too much. And for that, the politician who later became the Emperor Augustus removed him in rather an unpleasant way, which I'm not going to go into now. However, therefore, I shall try and avoid his mistake. But one of the wonderful things about the elderly is the way in which so many people say exactly what they think, even if we don't particularly like what they say. So let me give you an example. When Claire posted this introductory video for the session on Facebook, one of my friends who had been a work colleague, and I hadn't seen her for 15, 20 years or thereabouts, commented on my appearance. She said I looked odd because the camera was rather low down. You'll notice I've tried to lift that up so I don't look so odd. But anyway, anyone with an ounce of sensitivity might be a bit hurt when accused of looking odd. And anyone too young to be classed as elderly would be unlikely to come out with such a comment, even if that's what they thought. Hold on. Sorry. But the one exception here is in France. Now, I'm not knocking the French, and you'll see why in a minute. But when I was preparing for the discussion, I put out an appeal on Facebook for people to tell me what the most outrageous examples of ageism that they'd encountered and how they dealt with it. So the same person who made that unpleasant comment about me gave me two examples. Both were from France, which is a country, by the way, that I love almost as much as my own. The first was about a friend who was aged nearly 40. When she applied for a job, she was rejected. The person interviewing her told her that nobody could learn anything new after the age of 40. That's good, isn't it, for all of us? And then the second example she gave was of a psychiatrist who suggested to one of her students that over 60, anybody over 60 is basically senile, which again doesn't make me feel too good. So much for lifelong learning, you might think. But of course, France doesn't have a monopoly on ageism. But isn't it true that for most of us, if we do have a prejudice against the elderly, try our best not to show it? we're so sensitive to the possibility of being shamed that we'll go to any lengths to try and deny our innermost feelings. But occasionally things slip out, don't they? So where I come from, which is the UK, anybody who begins with a sentence saying, I'm not being racist or ageist or sexist, but, and comes up with but, is usually about to say something that is ageist or racist or sexist. Anyway, I was thinking about how to put my thoughts together for today, and it bothered me that I haven't a clue whether you're climbing up the hill towards achievement or whether you're joining me in the slow downhill slide towards oblivion. So I'm just going to take a second to ask you a few questions. First, how many of you think about getting older as being a bad thing? You might be worried about the effect on your careers, or you might simply dread not being able to run a marathon anymore. Or possibly you might worry that when you get to your 60s or 70s, you'll be bored stiff because you won't know what to do with yourselves without a job to go to. So anybody who actually has that concern, could you please text yes? I can't see the text, but anyway, maybe nobody says yes.
So Steve,
okay,
I've said
you're all absolutely unafraid of getting old. That's good. And the other
I said yes, Steve, in terms of
yes, did you? Okay, good.
Worries me about health, and yet I've got an assumption that I will have more time. And Kurt says yes, and Dr. Mohammed said yes, and Samira says yes, and Dr. Mohammed said the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that when we want to consult, at first consult with kids, and at the end consult with old men and women. No, we tell them that right brain is the more powerful in youth and left brain is more powerful in old men and women.
What's more powerful?
The right brain's more powerful with youth and the left brain is more powerful with old men and women.
Okay, interesting observation. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Yeah, so moving on, how many of you then feel absolutely fine about getting older because you think it'll be good? Could we have any yeses on that?
We had a no.
We have a no. I don't feel fine about it. Okay, good. All right, so we'll move on from there, and just hold on one second.
And we also have from Susan, hopefully I'll be wiser. Samira's worried she's stiff already.
Don't bet on it, I'm not wiser, but anyway. So what we're going to try and talk about today is ways in which you can immunize yourself against the sense that people think you're past your best for no reason other than you've reached a certain age. And by the way, that little story about the person who said that anybody over 40 is incapable of learning probably would have brought a smile to William's face, who was our earlier speaker. What we're not going to talk about is how to fight against ageism. Yes, you can, of course, confront attitudes head on, but you're not going to find it, but you're going to find it hard to overcome prejudice that's been around in some cultures for centuries. So what is the most important consequence of getting old? As I see it, it's actually losing your self-esteem, feeling that you're not worth anything anymore, that you're on the scrap heap, if you like, and that apart from your loved ones, nobody pays attention to you anymore. Maybe because you're not working, or maybe because you're sitting behind a filing cabinet somewhere. So the first and most obvious thing to say is that if you feel that way, there are unlikely to be many people who will go out of their way to change your mind. So doing something about it is down to you. So, one second. So I'm going to talk now about three things that we should be thinking about. Actually, the third one which is making it happen, you're going to talk about, but we'll take things step by step. First of all, planning. Okay, so here are some thoughts. Earning power may not be an upward curve forever. Our motivation may change over time, and emotional expectations are important. I'll go into those in a bit of detail now. If we want to be immune to ageism, I think first that we need actually to be realistic about ourselves and the environment where we're likely to face ageism. So let's think about the workplace, shall we? Most of us, especially if we're high flyers, reach the peak of our careers sometime around our 30s, between our 30s and late 50s. Would you agree with that, or am I being a little bit low on the age scale? I don't know. Anyway, after that, unless we happen to be Donald Trump or Joe Biden, we might get an uncomfortable feeling that we're in the way. Actually, come to think of it, they probably might have that feeling as well. But be that as it may, we might get the feeling that we're blocking career paths for those who are younger and maybe more energetic than we are. We probably think that all the more after reading this little article in the Times yesterday, which suggests that after 54, we start losing our passion and drive, which is a bit scary. It's a Norwegian study in there, and it's talking about the findings that from 53 onwards, our drive fades and we have less grit and determination. I don't actually believe that's true, but it's a study, and you take it with a pinch of salt. So another reason why a sense of security must be more common today is as we face the consequences of COVID. Even if we have what we think is a job for life, say in the civil service, we need to be aware that there will be huge pressure within society to make way for the young, for people whose lives at an early age have been blighted by unemployment. And here's another thing to think about. Several things may be happening in parallel while we move up the career ladder. We might have young families that consume everything that we earn and more, so we feel under pressure to earn more. And when we get to our 50s and beyond, we might find actually that our earning power is slipping. This can be worrying, and it's also frustrating because we don't feel we're any less effective or deserving of a high salary. But the problem is that we see earning power as an upward curve, and we don't consider the possibility that that curve might at some stage start taking a downward turn. Maybe we're made redundant, or we can't accept that a new employer should pay us what the last one did. Perhaps we also find it hard to accept that our role in our 60s might be different. And unless we own our own business and therefore control our own destinies to some extent, we may also find ourselves in a situation where the only option to us is to earn something is doing something like maybe stacking shelves at Walmart or Tesco or wherever. And if we don't see that coming, the effect on our wallets and on our self-esteem could be catastrophic. Hang on. Just 1 second. Sorry, my notes are suddenly failing me. Don't know what's going on here, but anyway. Let's just move on, shall we? Hang on. So, let's think now about preparing. Actually, planning is one thing, but how do we prepare? We should be prepared to transition to new roles, new careers. Perhaps we should say to ourselves, actually, life satisfaction is not everything, or earnings is not everything. Life satisfaction is just as important. And maybe we should take a hard look at our strengths and weaknesses. Do we need to reskill or concentrate on using our expertise in a different way? could you just hold on 1 second? I've got to do something here. I have a technical failure, and I will be with you in a second.
Can I help in any way, Steve?
No, it's all right. It's just a failure with Word. Hold on a tick. I won't be a minute. Something's gone seriously wrong here. And I will just try and do something here for a second. I'm on 2 computers, as you may not realize. Okay, I think we might. No, we're not.
So in the meantime, I'll ask a question to the group.
Keep talking. Ask me questions.
I will ask a question to the group in terms of what's happened with COVID over the next 9 months, reskilling. What's your thoughts around that? Any thoughts on reskilling because of what's happened with, sadly, so many people losing their jobs and so forth? Any comments from the last 9 months?
Yeah.
So, Dr. Mohammed, in terms of what's been going on with COVID and some people have sadly lost their jobs. I know from LinkedIn, for example, there's a number of people who are going for interviews and they're feeling rightly or wrongly that people who are younger than them are getting the jobs over them, and sometimes potentially with less experience, as if age is on the younger person's side. So in terms of reskilling, is there any thoughts out there in this group right now in terms of the impact of COVID and age and jobs?
Yeah, I would like to say something here, Claire. Well, it was a personal experience in the first month when we were in lockdown. It was denial. So I just stopped doing everything and just, continue just reading at home. And then I thought where this is going, and I just did a very big turnaround, going into virtual learning, virtual platforms, and online education, quality assurance. And it's amazing. It just opened new doors.
Thank you, Samira.
Okay.
And Dr. Mohammed says, unfortunately, some simple workers lose their job that can't improve their skills. It can be tricky, especially with finance as well.
True.
That is very true. I'm nearly ready for you again. Sorry about that little unplanned interruption.
No problem at all.
I always used to say to people when doing training courses is make sure you have triple redundancy. So if one thing goes wrong, you have a preparation, or you have contingencies in place. Fortunately, I do have a contingency in place, so that's good news, isn't it? Anyway, so going back to planning. We do need to plan, and perhaps we need to basically look at our finances, and instead of factoring in a steady upward line in earnings until bang we retire, we should cater for a gradual tailing off of income from our 50s onwards, perhaps some ups and some downs as we move to a period of less certain employment. And that's very important, to actually plan those things rather than to encounter them unexpected. We should also try to manage our expectations on an emotional level. No matter how committed we are to our work, we should also remember that we're not defined only by what we do 8 hours a day, 220 days a year. We're more than what we do for a living. And if we have a family, I hate to say this, but we're more than what we do for them. And if we fail to give our lives more dimensions, we risk ending up at 65 or 70 with no work, kids have left, just one or two of you, and very little else in your life. So to summarize, life is all about work. If your life is all about work and family, make sure that from your 50s onwards, you actually have more strings to your bow, more interests, more things you can do. So, preparing. What do we do, or how do we prepare for a time in our lives when we might fall victim to ageism? Not everybody actually has that experience as the person did in France, when somebody says you don't learn anything after you're 40. Perhaps the most important thing to do is to understand how our outlook on life might develop over time. If we manage to avoid being stuck on the same treadmill in our 60s as we were in earlier decades, how do we actually transition to different roles, perhaps different careers that play to our strengths, and perhaps our horizons have broadened? We're no longer interested in the narrow focus, we want to take the wider view. So let's say, for example, we are a research scientist. Maybe we win fame and fortune for our achievements in our 20s and 30s, just as Albert Einstein did. We might continue on the same path of research until we die. Or maybe we say, hey, there's more to life than this. I want to stay in the same field, but now I'm going to guide and encourage younger researchers, or I can be a head of research, or maybe a mentor, or I can use my fame in support of wider objectives, eliminating poverty perhaps, dealing with climate change, eradicating malaria. I may no longer get into the detail, but I make it possible for others to do so. So let's take a couple of real life examples. Just move to the next slide. You probably know who the guy on the left is. It's Jimmy Carter. So in 1980, Jimmy Carter lost the US presidency. He was 56 at the time, which was fairly young for an ex-president, especially by the standards of those of the time. So what did he do? He spent the last 40 years campaigning for peace and human rights. And when he was 78, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, not for what he did when he was president, but for what he achieved afterwards. And at the age of 96, as you can see here, he's still doing his best to help his local community. He's there with his wife building affordable housing in Georgia for people who can't afford homes. So Bill Gates, down at the bottom on the right, is another example. He stepped down from an executive role with Microsoft in 2006. And since then, he's dedicated his life and much of his fortune to a foundation that helps to combat poverty and find cures for infectious diseases. Now, I would ask, who is to say that he won't be remembered more for his humanitarian work than as a founder of Microsoft? Of course, we can't all be Bill Gates and Jimmy Carter. And I wonder at what point they started thinking about second careers. Was there a plan, or did they drift into it? And it's a shame that they're not here to tell us. But what we can do is to take a good look at ourselves, look at our strengths and weaknesses, and ask us how we might spend the rest of our lives if our current path comes to an end. So I'm not going to go into details right now on making it happen, because everybody's situation is different. That's why later on I'm going to ask you to do a bit of work by sharing your stories and maybe making suggestions. But at first, I think it might be worthwhile if I share a little bit of my story, which is one basically of three careers. First of all, growing a business, and then a period in between after I sold a business, and a second career, and then a third career. Let's get this. I put this picture on because Claire's in Qatar, so it's a bit of flattery for Qatar Airways, which I actually travel quite a lot on. So in 1991, after a decade of working in the Middle East, I started a business with a partner. I was actually 40 at the time, and I was married with 2 daughters under 5. So things went pretty well. Over the next 10 years, we ended up employing over 350 people in Britain, Ireland, Germany, France, Hungary, Finland, Malaysia, and China. And in 2001, we sold the division of our business for which I was the CEO. Though I had an involvement in the other side of the business, it wasn't full time. So with education costs likely to continue for the next decade, I wasn't really in a position to retire. And anyway, I didn't then, and I don't believe now, in the idea of retirement. But I did have more time. But to do what? I was 50. The previous decade had been pretty full on. So I'm not sure if it was by accident or design, but I started consciously to learn again. We learn naturally without thinking, but this was a conscious decision. I did a big digital research project on my family. I ended up digitizing thousands of pictures and doing video interviews with my parents. And the picture you see there is of my great-grandfather, who was, are there any Liverpool football fans here? Well, he was a priest in charge of the church, which was nearest to the Anfield football stadium. So that's the only connection I have with Liverpool Football Club, but there you go. Anyway, I also read books. I didn't really have time to read many books apart from business when I was working in a business. But I started to read books, lots of them, something between 50 and 100 a year. And my passions are history, psychology, geography, and a number of other topics. So is it impossible to learn once you've passed 40, as that French employer implies? Of course not. You should have spoken to my father. At 60, he bought a motorbike for the first time, and he learned to speak German. All around me, I see people of my age learning new stuff, including learning Zoom, to my eternal problem. But anyway, so I actually learned plenty. But learning is just one thing, isn't it? What do you do with the knowledge that you acquire? So here's another thing that you can do to immunize yourself against ageism. Start passing on your knowledge. If you're approaching the end of your career, if you feel you're approaching the end of your career, perhaps you can prolong it by being the best mentor, advisor, source of wisdom that you possibly can. And I always remember my Saudi boss in the 1980s telling a group of Western managers, and I was one of them, that the best way of prolonging their careers in Saudi Arabia was not by becoming indispensable, but actually by becoming the best at passing on their knowledge. Just 1 second, I think my mouse has just imploded. That's all right. Okay. So Claire, you'll know what this picture is all about. So for me, the idea of passing on knowledge led to a second career. In 2009, after managing a startup in Saudi Arabia for a year, I moved on to the Kingdom of Bahrain and started a training business. I wrote many courses on what people call soft skills, communications, conflict resolution, leadership, and so forth. But I actually don't think of these skills as soft. Perhaps it would be better to call them essential skills. For where would we be in any walk of life without the ability to communicate? And one of the most satisfying achievements of my life was working with a team of talented people to design and deliver a program for 60 bright school leavers in Bahrain. And you can see a picture here of some of them. It was called Going West, and it helped to prepare them for life at university abroad. And the motivation, the idealism and the enthusiasm of these kids was truly uplifting. And I hope that Claire, who played a major part in that program, would agree with me. Would you not, Claire?
Absolutely. It was a fabulous experience and learning on both sides. Really good experience.
Yeah, it was really a great experience. Anyway, So for the next 6 years, I ended up going back and forth around Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Middle East, running training workshops in factories, hospitals, government offices. Not only were they great fun, but they were great learning for me. For example, I learned all about desert truffles. And one guy in a hospital workshop taught me how to do ablutions before prayer, which is something I'd never even thought that anybody would show me how to do. So it was great learning, and hopefully it was for the participants too. By around 2016, the demand started drying up, and largely because by then I was back in the UK and it became increasingly uneconomical for my clients to fly me over for extended trips when they had local resources to call on. So I did a few workshops in Europe, but there was a slow wind down of paid work, which suited me fine. I didn't need the money, and there was other stuff to do, which leads me to. So the other stuff had already kicked off back in 2010. I started writing a blog, which I called 59 Steps. And you might ask, why the name? Well, I was 59 at the time, simple as that. Anyway, some of my stuff ended up being syndicated to a wide audience. And I also did a weekly column for one of the Bahrain newspapers for a while. And since then, I've actually written well over 1,000 original articles about politics, the Middle East, history, travel, books, and anything else basically that comes to mind. That's over 1 million words. The great thing about blogging is that it forces you to take a view about things. You could say it's basically my anti-dementia strategy. Whether that's actually working is for you to judge, especially when my technology breaks down in the middle of a talk. So during the spring lockdown in the UK, presumably you had similar lockdowns in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, yes? So we're all locked in. I set myself a target. Not quite the same as the centenarian who walked up and down his garden every day and raised millions from sponsors for Britain's National Health Service. Number one, I'm not a war veteran, and number two, whatever I did was unlikely to capture the public imagination. But my personal goal was to write and post one article to my blog every day, and I ended up doing that for 130 days. Normally, I would post maybe once or twice a week. Much of what I wrote over the lockdown was in the form of a series called Corona Diaries. But there were lots of other subjects, and it was quite tough because unlike newspaper columnists, I only had myself to rely on for ideas and research. And whereas I would normally take some time on a piece perfecting the language or the arguments, I learned how to post stuff rapidly, hoping like hell that I'd avoided some major piece of idiocy. So taking things up to the present, I'll be 70 next year. I've actually written a book about Saudi Arabia, which I expect to publish within the next couple of months. And I shall keep writing until I'm no longer able to string one word after another. And my self-esteem doesn't depend on how many people read what I write, but actually on whether it makes sense to me. I think of myself as immune to ageism because I like to think that I've capitalized on the advantages of being older. The ability to pass on knowledge, being able to laugh at absurdities, and still caring about what actually happens beyond my doorstep. And to an extent, my journey through these three careers has been deliberate, also partly accidental. As each phase of my life has ended, another phase has been waiting to take over. And when I look at my family, I see other examples. My father was a lawyer who continued to practice until he died at the age of 81. I have a brother who's in his 70s. He's a professor of statistics, and he continues to work on medical research. And I have a sister who spent most of her career as a medical doctor, and then in her 60s, she became ordained as a priest. So we like to say in my family that we get two for the price of one. She ministers to our bodies and to our souls. And then I have another brother who, after a long career as a teacher, is now a life coach. So you can see a theme here. People having things that they're passionate about, and they take over when one aspect of a career ends. So at this point, I'd just like you to forgive me if I share a few thoughts on the COVID crisis, because it does actually have some relevance to ageism. Ageism is a hot topic now, is it not? So the question is, should we wreck our economies to protect the old? Is it better to let old people die off because they've had their time, or spend precious resources keeping them alive? I only have one answer to that question. I look at all the people in my age group who've passed away in recent years, all in their 60s. David Bowie, Alan Rickman, Robin Williams, Tom Petty, Carrie Fisher, to name a few. So would I, like them, rather live a shorter life full of achievement, or a longer life in which I spend my last few years stumbling towards the end with little purpose or motivation? For me, the answer is this. The most important thing is not how long you live, but what you achieve in the time that you have. But that said, to ration care on the basis of an algorithm seems wrong. In the UK, during the height of the first wave, if you were over 75, the chances were that you might not get treated at all, and certainly not in intensive care, because of a scorecard that was weighed against you. The underlying philosophy seemed to be that people of a certain age no longer had anything to contribute to society if they were, quote unquote, economically inactive. So let's just think of the writers, the musicians, the scientists, and the thinkers who wouldn't have survived that brutal cutoff. Let's also think about beloved grandparents who bring so much support and wisdom to their families. And when a person dies, are they remembered fondly for being economically active? I don't think so. Anyway, enough on COVID. When I look back at the way that my life has worked out up to now, and how I came to have 3 careers, I have to make a confession. Despite what I've said earlier, none of it was planned. But had I prepared for it? Hell yes. I'd always wanted to run my own business. I've always loved communicating, and I've always loved writing. And the common denominator between all those 3 things was love. The things I loved to do, and I was lucky enough to be able to do each of them. So just to wrap things up from my end before we open up to discussion, here are 3 things I think you might like to take away, and certainly it reflects my philosophy. First, the valuable things we do in our lives are not always rewarded by material wealth. Second, we will never be victims of ageism if we value ourselves. And third, we'll value ourselves if we seek to do things that are valuable. And I think if we do those 3 things, we can become immune to ageism. So that's the end of the formal bit. Apologies for the break halfway through. I think we have about 20 minutes for questions, don't we?
We do, Steve.
Okay.
We do. Should we go to gallery view? Do you want to stop your slides and we can have a look at everyone whilst we chat?
Okay, I'll stop my slides. Hold on, if I can do that.
And if not, it's not an issue.
End show, right.
There we go.
Okay.
And then if you go to the bottom, it says stop slide share.
Oh, stop share. Okay, good, good, good. Oh,
Ta-da!
So now we have text.
Fabulous. So Steve, one thing, during that, there has been so many comments in the chat, so many that I can't read them all out. So I'm going to save that chat so that you get it, because I imagine there's a blog coming out from you around even just what people have put in the chat. People saying
some of them, and I'm very touched by some of the stuff that you're saying. Thank you very much. Especially
just so much
to Samira and Dr. Mohammed. I would love to visit Bahrain, to Iran, by the way, Dr. Mohammed. I would just love to visit it. It's such it occupies such a part in my understanding of history of the Middle East.
That'll be an experience one day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So take your mute off. Anyone, any questions for Steve? And I will save the chat, Steve, and get that to you.
Sorry, you'll save the chat. Okay, good.
I will. So Steve, if there was one thing that you could share with your children's children about the way to live their life, what would it be?
Oh boy, you have a whole library of these awful questions. Well, actually, I have. I'll probably give you a politician's answer here. Let me tell you about my grandson. I have a 2.5-year-old grandson. And the great thing about him is that he comes to stay with us once a week, and we love him very much. He's a very bright kid. And I think, and also he's a very curious kid. And so if I had one thing to say to him when he is old enough to understand what I'm saying, is stay curious.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Susie.
Hi, Steve.
Lovely to see you.
Well, I thought it would be interesting because, you know, as a freelancer all these years, I'm still drawing comics. And in fact, since lockdown, I've got another lease of life at 71, or 17, as I prefer to call it. I like to reverse the number. But, you know, up here, we've started a Northeast Bylines, and I do a regular weekly cartoon for that.
Yeah.
And I've taken to making frocks again, and, you know, just things that I know how to do, but haven't done because I've been too busy trying to earn a living. Obviously, for me, as a freelance artist, as you can imagine, I'm living on the state pension, and there really isn't any work around. So, you know, I haven't planned that very well, but I'm still curious, and I really like it. And my grandson, who's 13 now, understands that completely. And we had a great thing. I was looking after him about 5 years ago, and he said, you know, his dad was upstairs in the loft doing his dissertation, and he came downstairs for a cup of tea, and I was making lunch, and I'd said to Danny, no, we'll do that after lunch. And Danny said to his father, Granny Susie says I can't do this till after lunch. And Mike said, well, she's looking after you today. And Danny said, but she's just a kid like me. And I said, yes, but I'm an older kid. You know, what a fabulous, fabulous compliment.
Absolutely, that's wonderful. And by the way, for anybody else who's watching in here, I think the last time Susie and I met would have been, what, 1974, 75?
Oh, absolutely. Certainly 50 years ago, I would have thought, more or less, give or take.
So it's a special pleasure to actually say hello to you, other than the old post on Facebook.
Indeed, indeed. Well, it's lovely to hear you talk, and great that, you know, you've probably accidentally had 3 careers. I'm also involved with my local community and organise, well, it's kind of pagan, you know, I do 4 things a year. Yeah. Sadly, I can't really do Halloween, but there's a little rebel group, you know, I can't advertise it because I don't fundraise to be fined, darling.
Yeah.
I do not fundraise to be fined. So, but I have a lovely time. It's smashing being old.
It's not so bad, is it?
It's not so bad at all. Especially when you consider the alternative. The alternative's horrendous. So we'll just stick with, you know, it's not so bad.
No. You're definitely one of the people say it's not so bad. Good to hear.
Yeah.
Anybody
Thank you
else
so much, Susie. Any other questions? So, Steve, I've got one. A lot of people out there who, you know, they've lost their jobs recently, they're applying, and the feeling is, whether it's you know, they're saboteurs talking to them, or there is some reality in it that they're too old to get another job. What would you say to them?
Well, I'd say two things. Of course, you're not too old to get another job. But what's your motivation for getting a job? Is it because you need the money?
Usually.
To spend time with people? Or is it your self-esteem? Because there are many different ways of achieving the last two objectives than just getting a job. You know, life is more than earning money. And if people really do need to earn money, of course, then they've got to try and get a job. And the most important thing is to compromise with the kind of job that they get. I mean, I have a good friend who used to be a software engineer at Oracle, and then he went on to sales, and then he moved on to a number of other sales jobs, and then he had a period in his life when he was, well, basically he had no money coming in. It wasn't a big deal for him, but he felt the need to go out and work. So here's a guy who maybe had 30 or 40 people working for him, and he's off work for 3 months. What does he do? He does exactly what I mentioned earlier. He went off to work at Sainsbury's stacking shelves. But he didn't feel bad about it. He was quite delighted to do that, because actually what he earned was not important. It was all the other stuff. So I think we need to look at our motives for wanting a job, and see if we are having problems finding one, see how we can fulfill some of our needs in other ways.
Yeah, yeah. And you invent jobs.
Sorry?
I've never had much in the way of jobs.
Yeah.
Working for the man, as they say. You know, you just invent a job. You find something you can do that you enjoy, and you run with it. For me, anyway.
Yeah, good.
It's something that came up in another session as well, in terms of, you know, we know the old-fashioned career, you stay with the same company for X number of years and then retire, is extremely unusual. And yet, if we think of career as life projects, I just think that allows so much more spaciousness into the concept of career.
Of course it does. Of course it does. And you know, 50 years ago, well, when Susie and I were young, what should we say, young people, we were much more accustomed to the idea that we might go and work for somebody for 50 years. And there are still many cultures around the world where that continues to be the case. Japan, for example, and I don't know whether the Japanese have sort of moved from this idea of a job to life to a portfolio career to any extent. If there's anybody Japanese listening, perhaps they can comment on that. But you know, the idea of having a portfolio career in the early 70s was almost unthinkable.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other questions before we close? So, Steve, thank you so much for taking up this offer to speak at this conference on equality, diversity and inclusion. It was great to, just like Susie, great to connect with you again. And your wealth of wisdom and experiences are just amazing for us all to hear about. We appreciate you.
It's been my pleasure, and I hope that despite having to disappear for 2 minutes in the middle, those who are good enough to listen in maybe picked up on a few things. And I thank you all for your comments, some very kind ones. And from you, Claire, the suggestion that Susie and I need to get together for a coffee sometime would be great, except that if I went up to Newcastle right now to do that, I'd probably get arrested for breaking some sort of regulation. So hopefully there will be an opportunity in the future.
Lovely.
Yes, absolutely.
Lovely, yeah.
So thank you all for listening, and I hope to see you again sometime.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
It was great. It was great.
Really good stuff.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You
And
take care.
next up, we have Kurt in the